The whispers of the forest tell late night story. Welcome to DTC, the place of the brave, where courage meets the unknown, and every story pushes the boundaries of fear. In today's episode, we delve deep into the heart of a mysterious forest where something ancient, something unseen, stirs in the shadows. The Whispers of the Forest is not just a tale of fear, it's a journey into the eerie unknown, where every rustle of leaves, every soft whisper carried by the wind, holds secrets darker than you can imagine. What happens when you venture into the woods, unknowingly crossing a line between the real world and something far more sinister? Stay tuned, because this is not a story you'll forget. And remember, only the brave can truly face what lies hidden in the shadows of the forest. Ready to face the whispers? Let's begin. I had been looking forward to church camp for weeks. Nestled deep in the heart of the woods, it was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a break from the noise of everyday life. Days were filled with prayer, songs, and campfire stories that seemed to bond everyone together. But at night, when the counselors turned off the lights and the fire burned low, the forest felt different. It started as a dare. The stories about the haunted woods, about shadowy figures that lurked between the trees, about the whispers carried on the wind, were just that, stories. Nothing real, nothing to be afraid of. So one night after everyone had gone to sleep, my best friend Tyler and I decided to sneak out and explore the woods. The thrill of breaking the rules was enough to drown out any creeping unease. The air was cool, and the night was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. But the deeper we ventured into the forest, the more I felt like something was watching us. It wasn't just the silence, it was the way the trees towered over us, casting long shadows that seemed to move. We laughed it off at first, but then came a sound. A twig snapped. It wasn't us, it wasn't Tyler, and that's when I realized something or someone was out there with us. If you love spine-chilling stories, mysterious encounters, and tales that make you question what's real, you're in the right place. Subscribe to DTC, the place of the brave, and become part of a community that dares to explore the unexplained. Like this video if you enjoy real horror experiences and stories that keep you up at night. Turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying new story, because trust me, some things are best heard before the lights go out. Are you brave enough to keep listening? Hit subscribe and find out. As Tyler and I ventured deeper into the woods, the familiar sounds of the camp seemed to vanish into the distance, replaced by the unnerving silence of the forest. The usual chirping of crickets had quieted, and the occasional rustling of leaves was absent. All that remained was the steady crunch of our footsteps on the forest floor, and even that felt foreign, like we weren't supposed to be there. The trees, once just dark silhouettes against the night sky, now loomed over us like ancient sentinels. Their trunks were thick and gnarled, twisting in unnatural shapes, their branches stretching high above like reaching arms. The moonlight filtered through the dense canopy in jagged slivers, casting long, strange shadows that seemed to stretch and shift as we moved. At first, the atmosphere seemed eerie, but I chalked it up to our imaginations running wild. After all, it was just the two of us in the middle of the woods, sneaking around when we were supposed to be in bed. I tried to ignore the growing discomfort in the pit of my stomach, telling myself that it was all just part of the adventure. Tyler, as always, was in good spirits, cracking jokes and making light of every sound we heard. But the deeper we went, the more I began to sense that something wasn't right. The trees, once merely dark shapes, now felt like they were closing in on us, their twisted limbs clawing at the sky, as if they were trying to trap us in their web. We kept walking, but the path that had seemed so clear when we first left the camp now felt wrong. The trail we were following was no longer distinct, and the ground beneath our feet seemed to shift with every step. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but the trees were identical, tall, foreboding, and impossibly similar. It was like we were caught in some kind of loop, retracing our steps without even realizing it. No matter which way I turned, the forest looked exactly the same. The rocks, the trees, the dirt, all of it had begun to blur together. "Are we going in circles?" I asked, my voice betraying a nervous edge I hadn't intended. Tyler, walking ahead of me, didn't seem to notice the unease creeping into my tone. He grinned, his flashlight bobbing in his hand. "Come on, you're just freaking yourself out. We're fine. It's just woods, dude," he said, his voice steady, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes now. But the longer we walked, the more that sense of unease grew. The air itself felt different, heavier, thicker, like it was pressing in on us from all sides. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts, but the air tasted wrong, stale, almost sour, like something was decaying beneath the surface of the woods. I looked around once again, but there was no sign of the camp in the distance, no glow of the fire, no voices from the cabins, just the dark, oppressive forest stretching endlessly in every direction. "Tyler," I said, my voice low and tentative, "something's wrong. We need to go back." Tyler, who had been laughing just a moment ago, stopped suddenly, his body stiffening. For the first time he turned to look at me, and his face wasn't the carefree one I knew. His eyes were wide, his expression tense. He stared at me for a long moment like he was seeing something I couldn't. I don't know, man," he murmured, a note of worry creeping into his voice. "This place feels weird." My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't sure if it was the growing darkness or the feeling that something unseen was watching us, but I could feel my anxiety bubbling over. The path we had been following seemed to vanish into nothing, leaving us standing in the middle of an endless expanse of trees. The shadows seemed to shift, not just from the wind or the movement of the branches, but something else, something deliberate. Suddenly I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. I froze, listening intently. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the sound. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal, it was human? The whisper was too faint to understand, but it was undeniably there, just on the edge of hearing. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Tyler's face had gone pale, and he nodded slowly, his eyes darting around, searching the darkness. Yeah, I did," he said, his voice cracking. "What the hell was that?" We stood there, in the suffocating silence, trying to make sense of the noise. Then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. But the unease didn't leave. If anything, it deepened. I could feel something in the air, the weight of it pressing down on me. It wasn't just the forest. It was something else, something wrong. "Let's go back to camp," I said, taking a hesitant step backward. But when I turned around, I was met with the same endless expanse of trees. It was as if we hadn't moved at all. The deeper we ventured into the forest, the more distorted everything became. The feeling of being lost was only growing stronger, as though the woods themselves were shifting, closing in, trapping us. The trees seemed to bend inward, their twisted branches reaching down like fingers grasping for us. The air felt heavy, pressing against our chests, as though we were submerged in a dream where gravity had no hold. I looked around, trying to find something, anything, that would point us in the right direction. But the woods were unchanging, an endless sea of towering trees and deep shadows, each one identical to the last. It felt as if we had stepped into a parallel world, a place that didn't belong to the real one. "Tyler, we need to get out of here. Something's wrong," I said, my voice cracking. I could feel the panic rising in me again, choking me. But Tyler wasn't listening. He was staring intently at his phone, his brows furrowed in confusion. "Hold up," he muttered, tapping the screen several times. "What the hell? It was working just fine earlier." "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to make sense of his reaction. Tyler didn't answer immediately. He kept tapping, swiping, and shaking the phone as if trying to wake it from some kind of stupor. Finally, he looked up, his face pale, his eyes wide. "The clock's frozen. It's like the time isn't moving anymore." I frowned and pulled out my own watch. It had been working fine just an hour ago, but when I checked it again, my stomach dropped. The hands were still moving, but the seconds ticked by in an unnatural, sluggish way. I squinted at the dial, feeling the strange, crawling sensation creeping over me. The watch said we'd been walking for nearly 2 hours, but when I checked the time again, only 30 minutes had passed. My heart skipped a beat. Something was very wrong. "Let me see your phone," I said, trying to remain calm, but my voice betrayed me. I held out my hand and Tyler passed it over to me without a word. His expression was distant, as if he had already lost hope of finding any kind of explanation. I checked the time on his phone. The numbers on the screen seemed to mock me. His clock had stopped entirely, frozen on the same time it had been when we first looked at it. I tried to reset it, but no matter what I did, the phone refused to show anything other than that still empty screen. "This isn't just some glitch," I said, a shiver running down my spine. It's broken here. This doesn't make sense." Tyler's lips parted as if he was about to speak, but no words came out. Instead, we both stood there, rooted to the spot by the strange phenomenon we had stumbled upon. The woods felt suffocating, thick with a silence that pressed on us from all directions. I had never felt more isolated in my life, as if the forest was slowly erasing everything around us. It was as if time itself had lost its grip on the world here. I felt an odd compulsion to keep moving, to get away from the strange pull of the forest. But at the same time, something inside of me warned me to stay put, as though any attempt to flee would only make it worse. Suddenly the stillness was broken by a rustling sound from the woods. A branch snapped somewhere in the distance. I jerked my head toward the noise, my heartbeat racing. The movement in the underbrush was faint, too faint to belong to an animal. It was deliberate, calculated, like something was moving just out of sight, something watching us from the dark. "Did you hear that?" Tyler's voice was low, filled with unease. I nodded, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't bring myself to speak. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. Time was distorting. The air felt thick, as if we were stuck in a moment that refused to end. The whispering I had heard earlier seemed to rise again, faint and elusive, like a memory I couldn't grasp. And that sound, the rustling in the trees, was growing louder. It was coming closer. Without thinking, I grabbed Tyler's arm. "We need to go now," I said, my voice urgent. But before we could move, a cold wind swept through the trees. It was sudden, sharp, and biting, but it carried no sound. No rustling leaves, no swaying branches. It just moved, as if the wind itself was trying to make its presence known, and yet it felt more like a warning. I let go of Tyler's arm, instinctively stepping back. The wind stilled almost as quickly as it had come, leaving the air eerily calm. I turned to look at Tyler, and I could see the fear in his eyes. The calmness of the wind had left him unnerved, as though it were a sign that we were no longer in control, as if we had been caught in something much bigger than ourselves. And then, without warning, the whispering returned. Only this time it was louder. It wasn't carried on the wind. It seemed to come from all around us, a chorus of voices, indistinct but growing clearer by the second. The words were indistinguishable, but the tone was unmistakable. The whispering was pleading, angry and desperate, like voices trapped in the forest, begging to be heard. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest. "Tyler." My voice was barely a whisper. "Do you hear that?" He didn't answer, his eyes darting around, trying to locate the source of the voices. The forest seemed to close in on us even more, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, the trees bending toward us as if they were reaching out. The trees, they weren't right. They were watching us. I could feel their eyes on us, their twisted, gnarled shapes moving in ways they shouldn't. The time was still wrong. The woods still felt wrong. And somewhere deep inside, I knew, whatever was out there, whatever we had stumbled into, it wasn't going to let us leave. A loud snap echoed through the trees. Then the voices stopped. Everything went still. For the first time since we entered the forest, the air felt normal again, still almost heavy with anticipation. I held my breath, staring into the darkness. The woods had fallen silent. But I knew deep down that the silence wasn't an end. It was just the beginning of something far worse. If you love spine-chilling stories, mysterious encounters, and tales that make you question what's real, you're in the right place. Subscribe to DTC, the place of the brave, and become part of a community that dares to explore the unexplained. Like this video if you enjoy real horror experiences and stories that keep you up at night. Turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying new story. Because trust me, some things are best heard before the lights go out. Are you brave enough to keep listening? Hit subscribe and find out. The stillness of the forest was unbearable, like the world itself had held its breath, waiting. The air around us was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, thick and suffocating, as though the very atmosphere was conspiring against your every movement. But that silence was shattered, a jagged crack in the uneasy calm. A sound. At first, it was so faint I could have sworn it was just my imagination, my nerves playing tricks on me. But as the seconds stretched on, the sound became undeniable, faint but distinct. Dragging footsteps, slow, methodical. A heavy, drawn-out scraping, like something or someone was moving through the underbrush, just behind us. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. Tyler stopped beside me, his face pale, his breath shallow. We didn't need to say anything. We both knew exactly what we were hearing. My blood ran cold as I strained to listen, the sound growing clearer with every passing moment. It wasn't random. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was deliberate. Someone or something was following us. I glanced over at Tyler, my eyes wide with terror, but he didn't meet my gaze. Instead, his own eyes were fixed ahead, his body rigid. He slowly took a step forward, and the dragging sound resumed, moving in perfect time with our footsteps. I stopped again, and the dragging sound stopped. My pulse quickened. My breath hitched in my chest. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Tyler swallowed hard, and in the stillness his throat seemed to echo the sound of his fear. We exchanged nervous glances, but neither of us spoke. Neither of us dared to. It was as though speaking would make it real in a way that just standing there, frozen in place, didn't. The woods felt wrong. The air was too still. The trees were too quiet. And the footsteps were still there, watching, waiting. With a sharp intake of breath, I took a step forward, and the sound followed, the dragging footsteps right behind me. We weren't imagining it. We weren't alone. Someone was trailing us through the dark, imitating our every move. I wanted to shout, to call out to whoever or whatever was out there, but the words caught in my throat. What would I say? What could I say? The only thing I was sure of was that whatever was out there wasn't human, and it wasn't friendly. We kept walking, our footsteps hurried now, as though trying to outrun the presence behind us. The air seemed to thicken around us, as though the forest itself was closing in, its walls of trees tightening, restricting our movement. The darkness was absolute, a smothering blanket that seemed to devour every scrap of light. The dragging footsteps kept pace, never faltering, always right behind us. The rhythm was unsettling, too slow, too methodical, as though whatever was following us had all the time in the world, and that made my skin crawl even more. I couldn't help but feel that it wasn't just walking anymore. It was waiting, biding its time. Every time we stopped, it stopped. Every time we moved, it moved. "I can't take this anymore," I muttered under my breath, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound steady. Tyler didn't respond. His eyes were wide with fear, his face drained of color, but his gaze never wavered from the path ahead. He was silent, his hand clenched around his flashlight as if the object itself could ward off whatever was lurking in the dark. I felt my heart racing in my chest, the beat thundering in my ears. My legs felt like they were moving on their own, my body trapped in a strange, urgent rhythm. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was panic. My mind screamed for me to run, to do something, anything, to escape the suffocating presence following us. But I couldn't bring myself to look back. I couldn't bear to confirm what I already knew, that it was right behind us, getting closer with each step. Suddenly there was a rustle in the bushes just off to our left, a sharp snap of a twig. My body froze, and I heard Tyler's breath catch in his throat. The footsteps continued, slow, relentless. But now there was something else, a presence in the shadows that I couldn't see but felt. I could sense it, something watching us, something far worse than just the sound of footsteps. The air felt colder now, chilled, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in a matter of moments. The trees seemed to shift and sway, their branches creaking as though bending toward us, closing in around us. I thought I could hear faint whispers, distant and indecipherable, but my mind was so clouded with fear that I couldn't focus on the words. I didn't need to say anything else. Tyler nodded, and we turned and ran, the sound of our footsteps pounding against the forest floor in time with the dragging footsteps behind us, the whispering voices echoing in our ears. But this time, we didn't stop. Panic surged through me like a cold tide, crashing into my chest and stealing the breath from my lungs. My hands shook as I gripped Tyler's arm, pulling him forward, my legs moving faster than I thought possible. We had to get out of there. Whatever it was closing in on us. The sound of the dragging footsteps had grown faster, more deliberate, as though whatever was following us had finally decided it was time to catch up. The silence had been broken. There was no more pretending that we weren't being hunted. We weren't just lost, we were trapped. "Run, Tyler, run!" I gasped, my voice ragged, but I could barely hear myself over the pounding of my heart in my ears. I didn't dare look back, couldn't afford to, but I felt it, the presence, the weight of it behind us. The footsteps never faltered, the same slow, relentless scraping on the forest floor, now mirroring our panicked flight. The chilling truth was this: whatever it wasn't just following us anymore, it was closing the gap, it was hunting us. The trees blurred around us as we pushed through the underbrush, branches scratching at our faces and arms, as if the forest itself wanted to keep us there, wanted to trap us in its dark embrace. The night felt colder now, an oppressive weight hanging in the air, suffocating us as we ran. My legs burned with the effort, my breath coming in short gasps, but I couldn't stop. Not now, not when it was so close. Then, as if by some miracle, a flicker of light appeared ahead. At first I thought it was just another trick of the mind, another mirage born from fear, but then it became clearer. A faint golden glow through the trees, a cabin light, a chance. My pulse spiked with a mixture of disbelief and desperation. "Tyler, look, there's a light!" I shouted, barely able to keep my voice steady, but Tyler didn't need any more convincing. Without a word, he matched my pace, his feet slamming into the ground in sync with mine. We pushed forward, cutting through the forest as fast as our exhausted bodies would allow, the glow growing brighter with each passing second. The closer we got, the more urgent the sound of the dragging footsteps became. They were gaining on us, closing in. My stomach twisted, and a cold sweat coated my skin. The footsteps sounded like they were right behind me, echoing through the trees, taunting me. I could feel it, the thing following us, mere inches away from reaching out and touching us. I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat like a warning, keep running, but my legs felt heavy, the world around me spinning with the intensity of fear. The clearing ahead opened up like a lifeline, and the cabin was now so close I could almost reach out and touch it. Its warm light was a stark contrast to the dark, oppressive woods surrounding it. It was a promise, a safe haven, a sign that maybe, just maybe, we weren't too late. Almost there, just a little further. Tyler's voice was ragged, but I could hear the hope in it now. We could make it. We had to. But then I heard it again, the dragging footsteps, louder, faster. The thing was right behind us. And then, just as we crossed into the cabin's clearing, the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. It was as though the world had held its breath. The air around me shifted, lighter, less oppressive, like the very fabric of the woods had been torn apart. I skidded to a halt, my chest heaving with the effort, my eyes wide with disbelief. Tyler stopped beside me, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes darting around the clearing in a frantic search. I didn't want to turn around, I couldn't, but my legs felt like they had a mind of their own, and I slowly turned my head, half expecting to see something, anything, staring back at me from the darkness. Nothing. The woods behind us were still and quiet. The dragging footsteps had stopped, the eerie scraping sound now gone. The shadows remained, dark and impenetrable, but there was no movement, no sign of whatever had been chasing us. Just the empty, silent forest, as though it had never been disturbed at all. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, the tension in my body starting to drain away. For the first time since we'd stepped into the woods, I allowed myself to look at Tyler, and I saw that he too was staring into the forest, wide-eyed and trembling, trying to process what had just happened. What was that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, shaking my head, my thoughts scrambled and disjointed. "But we're not safe yet. We have to get inside." Tyler didn't hesitate. We both turned toward the cabin, the faint glow from the windows, now feeling like the only solid thing in the world. With no time to lose, we stumbled up the porch steps, the wood creaking beneath our feet as we reached for the door. My hands fumbled for the handle, my fingers numb with fear, but then, just as my hand made contact with the cool metal, I heard it again, a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It came from the trees behind us. "Leave. Now!" The words, cold and insistent, sent a chill crawling up my spine. But this time I didn't hesitate. I swung the door open, and without a second thought, I pulled Tyler inside, slamming the door behind us. The warmth of the cabin hit us like a wave, the air inside a stark contrast to the biting chill outside. We stood there for a moment, hearts racing, our breath coming in shallow gasps. Outside, the silence was total. The footsteps, the whispers, everything had vanished the moment we crossed into the clearing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe. Not yet, not completely. If you love spine-chilling stories, mysterious encounters, and tales that make you question what's real, you're in the right place. Subscribe to DDC, the place of the brave, and become part of a community that dares to explore the unexplained. Like this video if you enjoy real horror experiences and stories that keep you up at night. The days that followed that night were like a blur, a haze of disbelief and terror. Tyler and I never spoke about what had happened in the woods. Not to each other, not to anyone. There were no words that could explain what we had experienced, and honestly, I don't think either of us wanted to revisit the memories. It was as if we had both agreed, without speaking, that some things were better left unsaid. But the fear lingered. It was in the way I glanced over my shoulder when I stepped into the forest during the day, the way the sound of twigs cracking beneath my feet sent a jolt of anxiety through my body. The shadow of that night clung to me, even when I tried to pretend it didn't. The cabin had been a refuge, but I knew deep down that whatever had followed us that night was still out there. The woods were vast, ancient, and full of secrets that no one should ever uncover. But try as I might, I couldn't forget what I had heard in the darkness, the whispers, the dragging footsteps, the feeling of being hunted. No matter how hard I tried to push it out of my mind, I couldn't shake the knowledge that there was something lurking in those woods, something that wasn't human. The camp carried on like it always did, as though nothing had changed, but I could sense a shift. The counselors, the adults who had been so calm, so composed, now seemed on edge. They exchanged nervous glances when they thought no one was watching. They walked in groups, especially when they had to venture into the woods. The once familiar trails now seemed more treacherous, like hidden paths were waiting to swallow you whole. And the whispers, those whispers I'd heard in the night, seemed to have spread like a virus, infecting every corner of the camp. One morning, as I was sitting in the mess hall, trying to choke down my breakfast, I overheard a conversation between two of the counselors. I hadn't meant to listen in, but the words caught my attention, their tone heavy with a tension I couldn't ignore. I thought the last group had it bad, but this one, it's different. They're talking about it again. The woods, one of the counselors said, his voice barely above a whisper. The other counselor nodded grimly. I know. And this time it's not just stories. People are missing. Things are happening that can't be explained. The first counselor sighed, his face a mixture of exhaustion and dread. I don't know what it is, but we all feel it. It's like the forest. It's alive, and it's getting angrier, like it knows we're here. The words sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't stop listening. I wanted to know everything, wanted to understand what had happened to us that night, and maybe even find some kind of explanation. But the more I heard, the less I understood. These weren't just campfire stories or the usual ghost tales passed down from one generation of campers to the next. There was something real happening here, something that had been happening for years. Did you hear about the Johnson kid? The second counselor asked, his voice tight with anxiety. He wandered off into the woods last week. They couldn't find him, just vanished. It was like he'd never been there at all. The first counselor shook his head, looking down at his hands. They've been trying to warn us, but nobody listens. We just keep sending people into the woods, and they keep coming back. Different. The second counselor paused, looking around to make sure no one was within earshot. I don't think we should be here much longer. Something's happening in those woods, something we don't understand. It's not natural. The conversation trailed off, and I could feel my stomach twist with unease. I had always thought of the woods as a place of peace, a retreat from the chaos of the outside world, but now it seemed like the woods had a dark side, a side that was not only alive but actively seeking something, and whatever it wasn't interested in us being there. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I wasn't the only one who had experienced something strange. Tyler and I weren't the only ones who had felt the presence, the watching eyes in the darkness. The more I heard from the counselors, the more I understood that what we had encountered wasn't an isolated incident. The whispers, the footsteps, the strange distortions of time and space. It had all been happening long before we stepped foot in those woods. And it had been happening to others. There were stories of campers who had gone missing over the years, of people who had wandered off and never returned. The woods, it seemed, had a way of claiming people, of pulling them into its depths, never to be seen again. There were others who claimed to have heard the same whispers Tyler and I had heard, but none of them had lived to tell the tale. It was as if the forest was a living, breathing entity, one that fed off the fear and confusion of those who entered it.